Yeah, so today we have Chris Green with us. He's from Arup, which is, I think he's based out of London. Correct me if I'm wrong right now. So it is not 5 o'clock his time, it's 11 o'clock his time. So we got to be cognizant, or 10 o'clock, but it will be 11 o'clock soon. So, but he's based within Arup Digital Studio, which is a strategic design and user experience team based in London. His work ranges from buildings to non-buildings, from spaces to services, and from human interactions, innovative technologies. Some of his previous roles include designer in residence at the London Design Museum and project lead at MIT Senseable City Lab, and where he was developing urban applications for autonomous robotic systems, including aerial drones. So thanks for being with us, Chris. I'll let you take it away from here.
Cool. Thanks a lot, Langston. Yeah, I try to make it look as much like 5 p.m. here as possible. But yeah, greetings from London, everyone. And yeah, thanks so much for having me here. Thanks everyone on the call for joining. Sorry I couldn't be there in person, but hopefully another time. So I'm Chris Green. I'm a designer. Langston, thanks for the very succinct intro. I'll have to steal that that from you in the future. And I wanted to talk a bit today about really about a design practice that has come to shape really the work of our team in Arup Digital Studio, and also for myself. And there's this idea of UX for the built environment. And it was quite exciting talking to Langston about the different courses you have going on at Carnegie Mellon, and in terms of environments, communications, products. And in a way, what I'm going to talk to you about today kind of sits somewhere in the middle of that. And so that might be also something to think about in terms of how a number of you in those different courses might potentially be able to move into this space. And for me, coming as an architect as well, I've had a bit of a or trained in architecture, I should say. I had a bit of a pinball journey into this world, and hindsight is a beautiful thing. It all kind of makes sense now. I look back, but it perhaps wasn't the thing that I started out my career when I started off in architecture. So UX for the built environment. So UX is user experience, and this is really what we're saying here is that it's really a practice about understanding people and being able to design experiences that can respond to people's needs, challenges, in order to achieve some kind of better outcome. And I think often when we talk about user experience, we often think about it in the digital realm. You know, you see a job posting for a UX UI designer, it's usually for in the digital space. I think we're starting to see that change now as UX starts to move into a number of other sectors and spaces and services. The built environment being one of them. And so here it's really a question of how can we shape the world around us? And it's not just buildings anymore, it's also digital services, systems. How can we put all of that together to create these experiences that can create better outcomes for people, essentially? So I started off my career life in the architecture world designing buildings, and that was great, but for some reason things didn't always quite add up for me. I always thought we can design the best building we can in response to the brief, but what if that's not the right thing in the first place? And there's all these other things that we don't always necessarily have the responsibility to design as an architect, whether it's going down to the signage or the wayfinding that doesn't work and can really influence how well that place works for you as a person. So I was quite early on curious about what else can we be designing beyond buildings that can improve the environment around us. Around the same time, I started to get interested in emerging technologies, and this was when things started to pop up in the world that were really easy to point to, like Uber and Airbnb, and all these new digital services that were changing the way we move around cities, occupy cities. So this is when I then spent some time at MIT Senseable City Lab looking at a few different things, including, as Langston mentioned, urban applications for unmanned aerial vehicles or drones. And the question really became, well, how might we design technologies for cities to have some to integrate into the urban realm and provide some kind of urban infrastructure? And we were looking at projects such as this project Waterfly here, which was a swarm of drones that would go out and live on rivers and monitor water quality. So how might we integrate drones into cities as a really integral piece of urban infrastructure? So I got interested in how we might then start to design these tech applications for cities, and that's when I spent a bit of time at the Design Museum. I worked on a project called Aerial Futures, looking at different types of applications for drones in cities, and contextualizing how they might be used, in this case, activating rooftops as a sky garden and growing crops locally and enabling a new form of urban farming. But then the question really became for me, well, how do we design these applications? It's not just for tech's sake. I was enjoying designing these drone applications, but I was like, am I a drone designer now? What am I? I kind of came from this architecture world. How do we design these applications for human benefit? And that's kind of how I ended up at Arup. So Arup is a big design and engineering firm. We have offices all over the world. I spent some time in the New York office before moving back to London. Arup, you may or may not have heard of Arup, but this is probably one of our more famous projects. So Arup was the engineers in the Sydney Opera House back in the day, so it's been around for a while. Here's the founder of Arup himself taking a picture of the Sydney Opera House. So that's probably the first takeaway for tonight, is always document your work, as he's very well demonstrating here. And specifically, I sit in a team called Arup Digital Studio, and we're a multidisciplinary team of strategists, researchers, designers, technologists. We're really a strategy and user experience team. And we often get brought in to help people figure out what to do in the first place. You might think of us a little bit, sometimes we describe our team as like the GP for cities, or the primary care practitioner for cities. You might come to us first to then help figure out what are the challenges and what do we actually want to do in the first place before deciding on the solution. And to think about our practice, it really revolves around these three areas, around people, places, and technology. And it's recognizing the fact that the world we're living is changing. Our human context is changing from changing demographics, aging populations, to the ways in which we live, work, and play. But then there are these emerging technologies that are also influencing and shifting the way we design cities. But ultimately, in the bigger picture, there are these really pressing urban and global challenges that we need to be aware of, and we want to be in service of, whether it's social inclusion or moving towards net zero. So how do we go about this? So we have a bit of a, this is a bit of a working definition in Arup we have for UX, which is understanding user needs to design better human experiences that contribute to wider strategic goals. So it's not just designing nicer human experiences for the sake of it. It's really about understanding what our client strategic aims are, understanding what the pain points of people are, in order to then be able to design better human experiences that can help achieve these outcomes. So why do we do this? Well, firstly, one of our core focuses is around making more human-centered places. And in a way, we perhaps lost our way a little bit as a human species, particularly in the 20th century, if we look back at various examples from the modernist era, and none more represented than here in the Bijlmermeer in Amsterdam, which had all the really noble ambitions of making a great place to live for its new residents, with amazing apartments in the sky, removed from the ground, everything zoned, everything in its place, cars separated from people, everything perfectly planned. But then when it opened, there was one dirt road to the development, and there were no shops. The shops hadn't arrived. So even basic amenities that you need to live weren't there, hadn't been really designed as part of the development. And for the fuller story, I would definitely, for all the 99% Invisible fans, there's a whole episode on that, so I'm not going to do that justice. Roman Mars will do that way more justice than I will. But fast forward now, we see various examples of projects and buildings where there is a much greater focus on people and designing for people. One example I really like is the Helsinki Central Library in Finland, which, as they quoted on their website, they used service design as part of the planning process, which basically means they spoke to people and they understood what their needs are. And in an age when we can get all the information that we need on our phone, what's the role of a library in the 21st century? And so they then really dug into, well, what is it that people need a library for? And that's how they helped shape this building that's full of all sorts of spaces and services you might not automatically expect to find in the library, from study nooks to meeting rooms that you can book, to finding out about 3D printers and digital fabrication. And then we're seeing that play out in a number of different sectors, whether it's workplaces, companies trying to attract the best talent they can, campuses, cultural institutions, people coming back to visit galleries and museums, transport, how can we elevate the passenger experience, get people into public transport, neighborhoods, how can we build sustainable communities. So we're really seeing a rise in this kind of human-centered focus. Another thing to say, though, is physical and digital interactions are everywhere we look. They're just part and parcel of the way we live our lives now and the way we interact with cities and the world around us. It's also really easy to get it wrong. I would say there's 100 points for whoever can tell me whether the door on the left is a push or a pull door. I have no idea. I can't even quite remember where I photographed this. So even if we take something as simple as a door handle, there's physical and digital manifestations of this. I quite like the more tech-focused one on the right in this case, even because it's been thought about, and it's been thought about actually communicating the gesture and making that more human-focused. So we often have to think about contextualizing technology and choosing the right medium at the right time. And we often see this in things like signs all around us. So here's a few from travels over recent years. On the left-hand side, this was a staff directory at a university, a high-res, huge, big television screen that has one job, and that's just to list the staff directory, which is not going to change very fast at all. It's changing at 144 hertz, but it's not changing at all. So that's probably something where maybe a more low-tech solution may have made sense. But then there's something quite nice about the middle notice board, in this case in a co-working space in Sydney, which actually you sort of might think that would be quite good as a digital thing, but it's actually been crafted as this really beautiful physical sign that's manually updated, and you also can see that a lot of care has actually gone into making this thing. But then you have things like emergency evacuation maps, and I always think surely those should be the clearest and most well-designed maps we should have anywhere to do with life safety. But so often they're not. So could we be designing those in a better way? Are there other ways of getting that information to people via other types of digital touch points? Technology is changing the way we experience cities in a number of ways, and many of these need no introduction now. And we think about how Uber changed the way we call a cab to our location rather than going and finding one. We see things like e-scooters popping up everywhere, changing the way we travel first and last mile. Even autonomous shuttles now becoming more commonplaces to get trialed around in different cities. But there's also potentially consequences if we get it wrong. Uber and ride-sharing services contributing to congestion and pollution, last mile services if they don't have their right docking infrastructure causing, again, trip hazards on sidewalks, etc. And who knows about autonomous vehicles? That's really our opportunity to then start designing the infrastructure for this new technology as it comes around. And so one thing we quite like to do, and we often find ourselves doing in Digital Studio, is looking at, well, how might these technologies be integrated and designed into cities? So here was a little study we did for taking ordering an autonomous vehicle in the future, and everything from, and this was looking at future interfaces that might be used, everything from planning a journey, offsetting time against cost, and then pointing someone to a piece of physical infrastructure, and in this case, a civic totem showing local information that pops up into autonomous shuttle stop mode for a few seconds and creates this visual interaction, means someone else sees that this shuttle's coming along, they hop in, and then the system has become more optimized, more people are traveling in the shuttle. So telling these kind of stories, developing these kind of user journeys, telling the story of a user journey of someone taking a shuttle can be a great way of then unpacking what's all the different elements that we need to make this service and this experience a reality, from ordering, from the digital interfaces through to the physical infrastructure that might be needed as well. And that's all well and good if you want to make a great mobility service, but also what about zooming out? What about the bigger picture? What if we want to be able to design more human-centered streets? This was a little study we did a while ago, looking at how both physical and digital interventions can be used to take a more iterative approach to designing and transforming streetscapes. This was a street in Melbourne. It's basically a car park. It's barely a street. But what if we could start to introduce elements over time that might change that? What if we started with a Wi-Fi and sensor totem? Maybe that provides public Wi-Fi, but it could also be sensing the environment and giving us information about how well this street is performing, perhaps around environmental data, how many people are traveling. And then we can start to make moves. We can start to compact some of the parking, move the parking over there, introduce a bike lane. We can start to introduce new modes of transport and mobility, all potentially de-incentivizing traveling by car and reducing the need for parking. Over time, we can start to make bigger moves, introduce greenery. Eventually, you might be able to make the bigger move and create a shared surface that can be programmed with all sorts of types of human life. And to do all that in one go would be quite a lot. But iteratively, we could get there, and focusing on the user experience allows us to orchestrate all these different elements together, in this case, to make a more human-centered street. And it's this kind of approach that we can take to then start thinking about how might we tackle these bigger challenges that we're facing. Many of these, which again need no introduction, have become quite pertinent in recent months and times. How can we revive downtown areas as retail changes, and the impact from the pandemic? What does the future of work look like? Do we need to be working in offices, working from work, working from home? What does that look like? How do campuses play a role in education? All these questions that we can start to tackle in this human-centered way. And the solution might be a building. Again, let's come back to the beginning. We do still, and I do appreciate a good building, but the answer might be less building. It might be everything but the building. It might be digital services and products. It might be a question of building on what exists and the need to actually retrofit a lot of the buildings that we already have. Maybe we just need to be building less and focusing on upgrading the existing built environment, particularly when it comes to things like new energy infrastructure, or unbuilding. Do we actually need to get rid of buildings as we think of things like rewilding and introducing nature into our urban environments? So how do we do it? How do we go about this? So many of you will be familiar, no doubt, with the double diamond framework, or if not, it's another human-centered design framework. We often quite like to refer back to this, particularly as it really captures this way of thinking, this way of divergent and then convergent way of thinking throughout the process, from exploration through to synthesis. I'm not going to talk about all the specific things we do right now, but I thought I would just pick out some of the high level areas where designers can really add value, and where I think designers particularly have skill sets that can really add value to this process. So firstly, explore the problem. Now, it might sound obvious to us, but often it's very easy to, particularly in the built environment, to be jumping to solutions. Again, we might be thinking the solution is a building, but we don't stay long enough in that problem space to really explore what is it that we're trying to solve in the first place. Some projects we work on, if we can get in as early as possible, we can really take that 360 view to unpack, well, what is the problem we're trying to solve. Other times, and perhaps more commonly, a client will have an idea for a building or a technology, and actually our role is to help explore that, potentially validate existing ideas, but also then to update that with new ideas that come out of the process, and potentially then also create the space to reimagine new things that people hadn't thought about at all. Secondly is starting with people. So we are often not the people at the end of the things we're designing for. You are not your user. So it's really useful to find out more about people's behaviors, their needs, their motivations, what's important in their lives, so that we can design for it. And again, it sounds obvious, but also if I think back in my architectural career, that was just something that's not necessarily, it's something you thought about for sure, and we try to design in a human-centered way, but rarely do we get the chance to actually then talk to the people that would actually occupy a space or a building. So this really gives insights into needs and challenges that we can then design against. It gives us starting material for design. And this is often interviews, it's getting to the place, observing how people are using the space, the qualities. It's involving communities in the design process, in co-design processes. Another pretty key part of the process is this idea of reframing the question, to hark back to a much loved quote that we often refer to by Cedric Price, already way back in 1966. Technology is the answer, but what was the question? And I think one type of project that often typifies this is the idea of the smart building. So a client comes to us and says, I want a smart building. I often think our role in those kind of projects is to translate those two words into more descriptive and specific ideas. Because if we do that, then we can start to get a clear idea of what it is that they're really trying to achieve. Is it an efficient office, in which case it's really a project about trying to design effective systems and facilities management? Is it about an adaptable asset, in which case you have a building, but what could it be beyond a workplace? Might it take on multiple lives? How might it change over time? Or are we talking about healthy working, in which case the idea of working has completely changed? It's not necessarily bound to the office. So how might we design the idea of working in a new way? So all of this leads us to more specific and hopefully richer starting points for design. And then moving into the second diamond of the double diamond, the next part of that is really to explore the possibilities. And again, I think this is a bit of a superpower for designers, to stay in this space of ambiguity for as long as possible, and to help open up people's ideas as to what is possible. Again, coming back to the fact that the way we're designing cities now is physical, is digital, is made up of services and human interactions. So how can we create the space to do that? I really like this example this is something my colleagues did in the team for the Museum of London, where they ran a workshop that looks at the future visitor experience in this new building. And actually, the starting point for this was renders of the future building with people in it. We actually photoshopped the people out, which, as someone who has spent many years in my previous career life photoshopping people into images, the fact that we had to then Photoshop them out again was slightly amusing. But we use that then as a template, as a starting point to create these scenes and these cutout people that to be able to populate these spaces with activities and interactions and start to explore how we might enable a future visitor experience. Or we could do that at an urban scale as well. This was a card game we developed and ran with the city of Amsterdam to explore new urban design models. And again, thinking about how we might introduce physical and digital infrastructure into a place. In this case, a site just down the road from the example I showed earlier, the Bijlmermeer, to activate the public realm and to bring in the local community. Which leads me to my next bit, which is making it tangible. And again, probably another designer superpower is to translate quite abstract ideas and lofty ambitions into concrete visuals that people can react to. So again, here we were then designing a future scenario where a streetscape is activated in a flexible way. It could be a market on one day, and then it could be reconfigured into an open plaza for match day on another. And this can really range from many different modes of representation. It really starts with the sketch, and sometimes in a funny way, the sketch is almost the most powerful tool of all of them, because it keeps us in that early design exploration mode. And again, as someone who's produced renders for buildings, actually almost coming backwards and starting with the sketch, that we've actually found this to be incredibly effective. And then finally, it's really an opportunity to shape the brief and to influence design. I sometimes describe what we do in a slightly dull way, but it's not meant to sound dull, as creative brief making, that we're kind of just making better briefs for other people to make stuff with, except we're pulling design way up front into the project, so that we can actually design what we can actually define clearer what it is that we want to make. And this is a bit of a translation process. This is really part of this is trying to understand what's needed to take the project forward. Is it a high level strategy, a compelling document, or is it technical specifications for a new service or product, or is it influencing an RFP, or is it providing design guidance for an architecture firm? So I thought for the next 15 minutes or so, I will talk about a few examples of projects that we've worked on. So I was going to share, if we have time, 3 projects, and these kind of range from in scale and also in time in some senses, from things that have been built to things that could be built in the future, and from campus through to mobility through to city scale. So I'll start with a project we did with the University of Melbourne, and this was a campus UX strategy that we developed with them. And this was something that we started with them off the back of a concern they had over a lot of construction work that was about to override the campus and really change the way in which people would experience the campus, make it hard to get around. Beautiful campus today that was potentially going to get decimated by all this noise and construction. So they asked us, is there a solution for this? Is there maybe some kind of digital wayfinding app that we could do? And we said yes, probably, and maybe there's other things too. Let's open up the brief. Let's explore, well, how are people using the campus, and what are people's challenges, and what really defines the campus experience, and how might we make that better? So we went through this process of observing, documenting the site, understanding how people were using the campus, student interviews, talking to students and staff, understanding how they spend a typical day, what matters to them, running workshops with the university team, and unpacking all these various insights from particular things around the physical environment to particular behaviors that determined how people were using the campus. Little things like the fact that people would gather in the library late at night to work, because it was the one place where they could actually heat up their food and get some healthy food at night. So insights like that gave us clues into, okay, well, healthy food's important. We need to design that into anything we do. So we created this user experience framework that captured the breadth of experience across the campus, not just the academic needs, but also people's social needs and personal needs. So what does how can the campus support all these different types of activities? And off the back of that, we developed a series of design concepts, again here starting quite sketchy, ranging from construction hoardings, or the fencing that you often put around construction sites. Rather than that just being a piece of tarp, could that be turned into something that actually enhances being a student there? Pop-up workspaces, places to charge your phone, wayfinding, food, student spaces. So that was quite early in the design process, and we took that forward and started to develop what we called a kit of parts, a modular set of pieces that could be put together in different ways to assemble what we called a family of prototypes. And this was us taking forward those initial sketches and starting to develop out these wayfinding and food pop-up spaces and outdoor study pavilions that could pop up at different points around the campus. And we started to develop those in more detail. So this was getting a bit more into the construction hoardings I mentioned earlier, thinking about the wall as an inhabited wall that could provide places to work, to gather, creating green walls that could improve the environment. And we actually created a series of guidelines that even before they did any of that, could also just help the team. So this was one of the first instances of developing quite a simple brief to basically make the construction hoardings nicer. But we developed this guide that helped the university improve all the construction hoardings around the campus. And then going back to the pop-up spaces, so we then started to res these up in more detail, thinking about how these food spaces might pop up, how these outdoor study spaces might be deployed in different places across campus. How might they also be supported by things like off-grid energy infrastructure, so they're actually mobile and deployable in a more flexible way. It allows the campus to then react to changes over time. And then there was still some wayfinding in. So there was the original ask from the client for some wayfinding. And here we were exploring that in the form of an e-ink display, so kind of a big Kindle that could then point you to these different places around campus and reorient you to new pop-up spaces. So this was something we developed in a bit more detail in a wayfinding workshop to think about use cases for such a wayfinding system. And then ultimately one of these pop-up spaces was built. And again, as an ex-architect, that was certainly satisfying for me to see then this thing built. And again, going back to Ove Arup's point of documenting your work, doing the same here, and here you can see it being well lived in and loved with a coffee. This was recently taken by a colleague who, if they watch this back, then yeah, you know who you are. Credit goes out to you. Moving on to another example. So this was something we've been working on throughout the pandemic, and then more recently with Transport for Wales, thinking about how Welsh transport services can be reimagined and enhanced. And in Wales, there's the Welsh government has signed this Wellbeing and Future Generations Act, which really compels public institutions such as Transport for Wales to think about the long-term implications of their plans and creating benefit for people and communities, and being able to demonstrate that. So really taking a more human-centered view to the design of services and infrastructure. And as a starting point, we were looking at the bus service, which was facing declining numbers, taking the bus services really because there was inadequate service to begin with, and that was creating this vicious cycle of demand falling and then fares increasing. So how can we snap out of that cycle and then actually create a future where services are improved and actually attract people use the service, and then that can then decrease costs and increase demand for these services. So this was a project that we did a bit more user research on. This was something some of my colleagues worked on, which ranged from interviews with Transport for Wales stakeholders and others, as well as extensive interviews. Again, this was when the pandemic hit, so a lot of this was done over Zoom. This perhaps would have, more of this might have happened face to face if we'd had the chance, but also done in Welsh and in English. We also had another way of gathering insights into people's journeys through these digital journals. So participants that could actually use an app to take pictures, capture stories from their journey, which gave us insights into how they travel, their experiences, their needs, their pain points. And that gave us clues as to how we could improve the user experience along all aspects of the journey, from planning a journey through to getting on board, to taking a bus, through to onward journeys. And that led us to develop an experience vision that started to think about what are the key pieces that need to be kind of common across the whole network. Things like branding or ticketing and fares, elements that will really ensure that this becomes a trusted and understood and clear and usable service. But then celebrating the fact that then there might be local variations to a particular area, whether it's a local information overlay or the seat fabrics for a particular area. And again, we went through this then translation process of deciding to design concepts that could respond to people's needs. And this ranged from bus riders being able to get help across a range of different points along their journey, to enabling opportunities for new local businesses. And we can then start to map these across a few future journeys and articulate what a better journey could look like in the future. And we started to then work on other areas apart from the bus as well. So we developed this, what we called a strategic customer toolkit with Transport for Wales that allowed them to start taking a more human-centered view and approach to other projects. So this included a set of personas, all based on research from real people, to that become the kind of characters by which they can tell stories about how a future design should be, what experiences should we be put in place to address their needs. And we can use that to then test designs later on as well. How does a potential design solution respond to busy Bethan's Day or predictable Pat, all which have particular travel behaviors and traits and characteristics. Also, we developed a series of design principles that again can be used to inform design across a whole range of aspects of the service, whether you're talking about a digital app or a physical environment. We started to look at the future of the rail service and develop concepts that could enhance the journey, and that ranged from everything from ideas around booking plus or a kind of super booking ability that would allow people to almost look into the future in detail about what their journey would look like, all with the aim of instilling confidence and dispelling anxiety around traveling, which is something we heard from the research. But equipping staff with the knowledge they need to be able to answer any question that a customer might throw at them, or thinking about new digital services that could change people's behavior and reduce our carbon footprint. And more recently, we've then started to apply that to the design of physical infrastructure and stations or transport interchanges. And this is something we actually just very recently finished, and we were looking at how we might start to then think about design solutions across all aspects of the interchange experience within the building, but also then bleeding out into the public realm and the broader city. And again, using the personas and user journeys to tell the story of how these things add value to people, and ultimately culminating in a toolkit that could be applied to a range of projects going forward. So in the last few minutes, I'll sneak this last project in. And this was something which was a little bit more of a design research project, maybe a little bit more, part of this was a bit more speculative, but this was something we did with Sidewalk Labs, which is actually, they are, have recently been folded into Google, but whilst they were Sidewalk Labs, we did this piece of work around a street kit of parts. And that was really something that Sidewalk Labs are looking to develop as part of their streets program and their ambitions to create more human-centered streets. And being Sidewalk Labs, they had 5 years of research into city making from all the work that they've been doing over the last few years around creating urban realms. And they also had a focus on technology and how might technology add value to people in the future. But what we were really doing this work for was to try and get clear on the use case for those technologies, and design concepts that took advantage of technology, but then really became integrated in the street to then create some kind of human benefit. So we started with research, really basing it on, in this case, more basing on existing research, and went through a quite rigorous process of prioritizing use cases, synthesizing the use cases that we want to focus in on, the problems and the challenges that we want to solve, and then developing a whole range of design concepts. This again was something that happened when the pandemic hit. So, as will probably be no news to many on the call, but we had to learn very quickly to make Miro work very hard for us as a design space and as a crit space and a collaboration space with the client. And over this process, we developed a range of street concepts, and I'll just talk about a couple now. One was this idea of the dynamic parklet. I was really responding to the kind of limited opportunities that we see and the difficulties to make more human-centered streets. How can we make more of a human-centered environment, but also still retain that ability to remain flexible to vehicles when we need it? If we need a delivery vehicle to pop up, for example. Obviously, we saw parklets emerge everywhere during the pandemic, which were absolutely great. But what if those could also be more responsive to demand, both in terms of setting up, but also in terms of changing modes throughout the day? So we created this concept of the dynamic parklet, which then could be used, in this case, showing it in obviously the typical dining mode, but it might have various functions attached to it as well, like a last mile bike or scooter dock at the end. And we worked through and we used this concept design process to figure out, how does this thing work? How might this work throughout a day? What's a day in the life of a parklet look like? And we developed what's almost a bit like a service blueprint to explore the experience and then start to map, well, how does that work in terms of who's operating it, who's changing, who's opening and closing this thing, what's the technology doing, and informing requirements for the technology as well. And so again, this was then a combination of physical and digital parts that came together, all sorts of different types of components that would need to be put together to enable such a concept to come to life. And I think that's really the power of this kind of concept design process, is to bring together all these disparate pieces in a really clear idea of how something works and articulate the value of it. And I think often we jump to solutions, and it's all too easy to jump to solutions and say, okay, well, we need we need this thing or we need that thing. But if we can root it in a concept, we can get really clear about why is it that we're doing it. And finally, another concept that was a bit more speculative and thinking to the future was around various safety concepts. And one idea was this idea of the on-off street, and using technology in this case, dynamic road markings, which was actually something the research partner on the project was developing. We were looking at potential use cases for these different types of markings, and here we were looking at, well, so often streets are made for cars, but what if we really just flipped the script and said it's for people, and we invited vehicles in when it suits us. And this might then also work in an autonomous vehicle world, and particularly when vehicles are talking to each other, when vehicles are talking to the infrastructure around, the road might be able to detect when a vehicle is coming. Often these shuttles are moving pretty slowly anyway, and you might then be able to actually draw the road on temporarily, make a temporary road there for the vehicle to pass, and then indicate that it's coming, and then disappear again once it's left. So really flipping the script and making streets for humans where vehicles are the guests rather than people are guests to the street. And that's about it. That's me. So whittle through quite a lot there, but yeah, thanks very much, and yeah, happy to take any questions.
Yeah, if anyone has questions, feel free to unmute, or you can just put them in chat and I'll ask Chris.
I have a question. It seems like a lot of the work focuses on like changing how existing spaces are used, but what are your thoughts on like companies, or I guess mostly companies, that are working to create new spaces that are human-centered, like either big architecture? I know this company Cul-de-sac is working in Arizona, I think, to create like walkable cities.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, I mean, in a way, that's there's even more freedom to play then. In a way, I kind of feel like we have no excuses if we're starting from scratch, because there's no existing constraints or challenges. But I mean, having said that, obviously the existing built environment also, like creativity is also partly made through constraints. So I think that's also the beauty of working within the existing context. But I think it still comes back to, why are we making a place in the first place? And I think that's really going back to this idea of exploring the problem. If we're making a place from scratch, you kind of have full remit to take a kind of carte blanche approach and say, well, who is this for, and what's the narrative of the place? What's the value of people being here? And then how might we design for that? I think one thing we often see is, I think there's a big question about how we design for adaptability as well. There's often people that will come back and say, yeah, but we don't know what 10 years time looks like. And that's right. We don't. I think there's a desire to future-proof ideas and to anticipate the future. And we can't predict the future, but we can build it, and we can build with what we know today and the ambitions that we have for tomorrow. And so if we can do that, then yeah, I think there's huge opportunity if we can design in a more adaptable way, and then but really design in the outcomes that we're trying to achieve. Then whatever technology comes around at a later date will then have to fit into that. I mean, in a way, I'm also a believer of low-tech solutions being just as, if a low-tech solution is better than a high-tech solution, that's fine. You know, the high-tech solution is going to have to work even harder to be better than the low-tech solutions. I think that's what's important about defining these briefs early on, as it gives future solutions something to react against as well.
It looks like Mallory raised her hand as well. I don't know if Mallory, you want to ask in chat, or if you want to unmute and ask your question.
Hi, yeah, I have a question as well. So I think a lot of these changes are really amazing, and I think we should all be working towards, more sustainable, walkable communities. But I think a lot of times it can coincide with displacement of low income and people of color that have built those communities and the cultures around there. So I was just wondering how you kind of account for that and work, to make a great space for everybody.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I haven't really focused on this so much in this deck, but actually designing with communities is what we need to be doing more of. So I think going in the spirit of the antidote to, again, the modernism planning, there's the danger that a lot of this stuff just becomes like a top-down solution, and we fly in and say, okay, here's your new human-centered street, but actually that's that's not great if it doesn't actually, if the community hasn't been involved in the first place. But I also think this is where there's real opportunity to then use more of these research and design approaches, whether it's through co-design workshops. I think a lot of this, there's a real role for designers to be able to play facilitator there and translator, and to be in the middle of that, and even again when it comes back to be able to communicate different ideas also in a visual way, or in the appropriate way for the solution, for the situation. That's incredibly powerful. I don't think that's necessarily taking agency away from the designer. Actually, that it just makes the design better if communities are feeding directly into the, if we're making space for communities to contribute to the design, and they're feeding directly into the design process, and then designers in a way can become, they can help negotiate those conversations with the right partners, of course, and with local partners. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll ask a question too. I was wondering, for students or young professionals who are looking to get into like a career of user experience for the built environment or service design, kind of in the sector that you work in, what things would you look for in like a body of work or thought process, or what skills do you think are like invaluable for someone in your?
That's a very good question. Yeah, so I think it's, I think this is a space where I think you can come at it from a number of different angles, and certainly the courses and angles from Carnegie Mellon. But I think there's also spaces within UX design in this context where many people might focus depending on their interests. So I mean, I have colleagues who are sort of dedicated user research, where they go, have real depth and expertise around user research, and that's amazing. And some of them have planning backgrounds where they've kind of moved into this space, but they've also then really gone deep into this. I think others might be more. Well, I would say our team is generally a team of generalists, rather than the specialists per se. But you can be a professional generalist. It's not like you're not good at anything. It's actually that your role is to be connecting the dots. And I think that's probably maybe one of the perhaps underlying things to think about is that kind of systems thinking, and connecting the dots between what is a challenge, to how might I solve that for a person, through to what is the broader outcome. And I don't think you have to be, I don't think you have to be able to like to draw a city axonometric drawing in detail. If you can, great. That's really valuable. If you can't, there's so many other areas of the process. It doesn't hinge on that one skill. Actually, it's more about the thinking, the process, particularly the systems thinking, and articulating how a design idea creates value for a person. And there's also so many creative ways of expressing an experience as well. As I say, it's not just drawings. It's writing, it's film, it's physical prototyping. I haven't shown so much of that here, but yeah, there's many different ways. So in that way, the practice, I would say, is quite malleable. Yeah.
Awesome, thanks, Chris. Are there any other questions for Chris?
Thanks so much for the questions. Great questions.
Well, if there are no other questions, then we'll get you out for 4 minutes early, Chris, if you're all right with that.
Yeah, that's doesn't happen every day. That's yeah. Very
All right, well,
pleasantly
sounds
surprised.
like, yeah, I sounds like we're probably wrapping up here. So we'll let you get some sleep tonight, Chris. Thank you so much for your talk today. It was a pleasure to have you here. We don't always have someone who's architecture who flips into this field of experience design or user experience for built environment with a design system thinking led. So it's unique. So really a pleasure to have you here today, and we wish you all the best.
Yeah, absolutely. No, thanks so much for having me. It's been great. And yeah, have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. You too. Or great rest of your night. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.